Ms. Jackson Lee, I just promoted you. Are you able to hear and see me okay? I'd like to test out your audio and video if you're able to.
Can you hear me?
Okay. The Rules Committee will come to order. Today, we will be considering amendments to H.R. 3684, the Invest in America Act. I expect we'll be hearing from many members this afternoon, so let's get right to it. Before we hear from our witnesses, though, let me turn to Dr. Burgess for any opening remarks he'd like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And on behalf of Mr. Cole, I just want to point out that there are some thoughts we've had about, and hopefully could guide this committee in its deliberations today. Across the titles of this bill, members have submitted over 300 amendments for our consideration. Just over 100 of these were submitted by Republicans, or 34%. More than 150 were submitted solely by Democrats, or 54%. And the remaining 30 are bipartisan, 11%. Throughout the 117th Congress, the majority has unfortunately failed to make a significant number of either Republican or bipartisan amendments in order. Across all bills, Democrat amendments make up 74% of all amendments made in order, while Republican amendments constitute just 20%, and bipartisan amendments are 6%. Today's hearing presents us with an opportunity to begin to turn these numbers around, and I hope the majority will certainly take that opportunity. I thank the chairman, and I'll yield back.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And we'll try to do better than you did when you were in the majority and not break the record of having the most closed rules of any Congress in history. But in any event, let us proceed. I want to welcome our next panel to testify. Mr. Brady, Ms. Dusty Johnson, Mr. Hank Johnson, Mr. Al Green, Ms. Jackson Lee, and the Honorable Chip Roy. And we'll begin with Mr. Brady.
Great. Thank you, Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, Mr. Burgess, the rest of the committee. Thanks for all your work for the meeting today. So the amendments I bring before this committee are simple, common sense reforms that strengthen the integrity and taxpayer safeguards of the Railroad Rehabilitation and Improvement Financing Program, as we call it, RIF. While the RIF loan program has great intentions in providing short-line freight railroads with the means of alternative financing, in recent years, loans from this program have been sought after by the passenger rail and the high-speed rail projects. And according to the Department of Transportation, 85% of the loans issued through RIF have gone to passenger rail projects to date. This is not the original intent of the program, and the program, as it's currently designed, lacks the necessary safeguards for passenger rail and high-speed rail projects. These projects tend to be costlier, according to experts, often fail to generate adequate operating profit to cover their capital costs, higher risk. So lending these programs without the necessary safeguards puts taxpayers at risk. My two amendments provide crucial safeguards for this program. The First Amendment, 249, requires that high-speed rail projects applying for RIF loans have Surface Transportation Board approval. High-speed rail projects are risky endeavors, and this amendment verifies that these projects have the necessary permits in hand before receiving a single dollar of taxpayer-subsidized funding through RIF. Second Amendment, 251, brings RIF taxpayer safeguards up to par with TIFIA program by reducing the federal share of a project's cost and provide what they call a springing lien program, which protects taxpayers in the event that they default on the loan. My district constituents are seeing firsthand how high-speed rail projects with uncertain financing and lacking the necessary permits are looking to the RIF program for funding. Just last year, Texas Central Railroad, private company that claimed for years they would never ask for federal or taxpayer funding, lobbied Congress to loosen the RIF lending requirements even further so they could get federal dollars for their risky and controversial project. These amendments protect federal taxpayers, not only in my district, but across America, just to make sure constituents of ours aren't stuck holding the bag when rail projects default on their loans. I'm hopeful we can all agree with these amendments that taxpayers shouldn't be left on the hooks if these projects fail. Mr. Chairman, that's about as fast as I can talk. Thank you very much for having me.
That's pretty fast for Texas.
For me, it
Thank
is.
you, yeah.
For me, it is.
Thank you very much.
Chairman.
Dusty Johnson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I believe my amendment has been designated as print 117-8. And by way of preface, I just want to show the committee a few pictures from tribal pieces of infrastructure in Indian country. So this is a picture of the same road. It gives you a sense of the massive gaping crevice that opened up on this. I believe this is BIA 3 in South Dakota. These are some pictures I took of the same road at a different time of year. You can see in the middle of the road this massive sinkhole. And then here's me. Now, if you, that doesn't look odd if I was in the ditch, if I was on the side, but I'm not. This is in what should be the middle of the right lane. And you can see I'm standing 4 feet below grade. And I was given that quality, that lack of quality of infrastructure, Mr. Chairman, I was very grateful to see that this bill makes a substantial investment in transportation in Indian country. But I would tell you the problem is not just funding. We also have a serious deficiency in the data that is used to distribute this funding. Now, you don't need to take my word for it. There are 9 different tribes in South Dakota, and probably the most consistent complaint that I hear from tribal leaders when they come to D.C. to talk to me is that the data used to distribute these dollars is woefully inadequate. The model itself, the data is antiquated. And so, Mr. Chairman, that's all that this amendment does. It requires that the data that is used to make these decisions is indeed up to date. The data that's used today is more than a decade old, and it seems to me that we should, at the very least, in a bipartisan way, endeavor to use accurate information when we're making these decisions. We need to do this, Mr. Chairman, and I would close by explaining why, although I think you know. I mean, our federal government has a treaty obligation to consult with tribes. And the bill is currently written, I think, does not honor that commitment. I think the House majority in the bill that they have today is seriously deficient in that way. I think we need to fix it, because if we don't do that, then I think the House majority will have once again broken our commitment to Indian country. Let's fix the bill. My amendment would seek to do that. And with that, I would yield back.
Thank you very much. Hank Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to speak on behalf of my amendments to the Invest Act, Amendment 74, 133, 139, 148, and 159. Mr. Chairman, safe and affordable and convenient transportation is freedom. It can mean the difference between getting and keeping a job, seeing family, having access to food, health care, and education, or exercising one's fundamental right to vote. It can even mean the difference between having a jury of your peers or a jury of those who can afford to or are able to drive. Unfortunately, our country has underinvested in public transit, and today, too many Americans rely on infrequent and unreliable service. Public transit is essential, and that is why I have offered common sense amendments to build on these significant investments to expand and improve public transit service. I'm offering 5 amendments to invest in public transit operations. Amendment 139 and 148 would prioritize an improved service in the transit deserts grant program by removing construction of maintenance facilities and adding new service hours or days as an eligible expense, respectively. Amendment number 159 would further improve this important program by adding $4 billion over 4 years. Amendment number 133 would increase the amount of funding eligible for public transit operating expenses under the Carbon Pollution Reduction Program to 20% of eligible funding. Together, these amendments would improve public transit service across the country. Finally, my amendment number 74 would create a new high-quality transit operating support program dedicated to funding substantial improvements to transit service in urban, rural, and tribal communities. This program is designed to grow and improve service with a focus on underserved and communities of persistent poverty. This program would complement funding for building new rail and bus lines by providing the resources necessary for transit agencies to run that new service frequently. With this program, people would not have to wait so long for the bus or train. There would be additional hours of service so that those who don't work 9 to 5 can still get to their jobs and home again to their loved ones, and there would be new frequent service. Transit agencies shouldn't have to choose between operating good service and buying new or additional buses or train cars. While I intend to withdraw this amendment, number 74, I look forward to working together to create a public transit operating program in the future. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Green.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members. I'd like to call to your attention Amendment 117-9. This amendment, Mr. Chairman and members, would require the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency to publish a maximum contaminant level goal and establish a national primary drinking water regulation for chromium-6 within 2 years of the bill's enactment. Hexavalent chromium, or chromium-6, causes irritation, ulcers, kidney damage, liver damage, circulatory, and nervous tissue damage. The American Cancer Society lists chromium-6 as a known and probable human carcinogen. No national drinking water regulatory standard for chromium-6 alone exists. Chromium-6 in Houston, Texas is a problem. In my district, in A-Leaf, an area within my district, the levels are registered at 6.7 parts per billion. In California, the Environmental Health Hazard Assessment has stated that the risk of developing cancer from chromium-6 begins to increase at just 0.02 parts per billion. It is estimated that over 200 million Americans are exposed to drinking water with unsafe levels of chromium-6, according to the Environmental Working Group. This is a nonprofit that concentrates on public health issues across the U.S. My appeal is that we do what we can to make sure that the drinking water in this country is safe for all Americans. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Jackson-Lee. Ms. Jackson-Lee, you're up.
Can you hear me now?
I can, yes, okay.
Oh. You can hear me.
Yes, in stereo.
Thank you so very much.
Yeah.
Let me thank the Rules Committee for their courtesies, and thank you so very much for giving me the opportunity to speak to several Jackson-Lee amendments as quickly as I can do so. Amendment number 237 is intended to make walking, and I do this with Congressman Estaniak, and I thank him so very much for his leadership. We're delighted to do this together. It speaks to the very wonderful opportunities of mobility of walking, biking, motorcycling, and other pedestrian travel to make it safer by making changes to the new Safe Streets program already in the bill and to allow local input in decisions by State Department of Transportation on projects intended to reduce fatalities of road users. Again, it gives local governments more control over where the funds for the new Safe Streets program are spent by requiring State Department of Transportation to consult with the local governments before carrying out these complete streets projects. The Safe Streets program sets aside safety funds and to reduce fatalities and serious injuries on public roads with a focus on vulnerable road users such as pedestrians, bicyclists, scooters, users, and motorcyclists. This amendment is particularly important because we in Harris County and Houston and Texas really have a very poor safety record as relates to our citizens, really Americans, who want to enjoy walking, pedestrian activities, biking, motorcycle, and others. Recently, after the Juneteenth legislation was passed, we did a freedom ride, Juneteenth freedom ride with Mr. Rodney Ellis with Bike Texas. It was a 58-mile bike that some of the participants took, and I joined them at a later point. These are the kinds of activities you want to make sure that are safe. But at the same time, I want to bring to the attention of the committee, as I conclude my remarks on this particular amendment, is that motorcyclists are killed, and they like to be able to do their particular mobility safely. On May 9, 2021, a hit-and-run driver who allegedly ran a red light slammed into a motorcycle, killing them. At Holly Hall and Highway 288, Jamal, who was a member of All Sports Riders and also supported by Queens of Space, there was a motorcycle bicyclists in my district, are intimidated by the way people treat them on the road. On May 30th, 2019, we lost a young man by the name of Jesus Perez, who was struggling to cross the intersection in a wheelchair. David Leon Lawyer was killed on May 7th, 2019. So I asked my colleague to support Jackson-Lee and Esplanade amendment, and I thank you for your consideration. The Jackson-Lee 15 Amendment amends Section 12020 of the Water Quality Protection and Job Creation Act of 2021, which is Division H of Rule Committee print. This deals with a study on the distribution of wastewater infrastructure funds to rural communities, economically disadvantaged communities, and tribal communities during the fiscal years preceding the date enactment of the. This would require, this study particularly talks about idea of the lack of these wastewater resources in urban poor areas as well as rural. And so this amendment, I believe, is very important to be able to go a step further and add a fifth requirement that the EPA administrator endeavor to calculate, measure, document the harm and injury caused by any identified inequities in the distribution of wastewater infrastructure funds with respect to the identified needs of rural communities, economically disadvantaged communities, and tribal communities. Ask my colleague to support that. This was a path-breaking study, and it really does report on the issue of flushed and forgotten sanitation and wastewater in the rural United States. That was a report that really affirms this. By the way, let me thank the Transportation Committee staff and the staff dealing with the order issues for being so gracious with our amendments. Let me give my last amendment, if I might, that deals specifically with the idea of the freeze, and that is dealing with setting aside under this section the ability to provide help as we needed in the freeze that occurred and killed 51 people in the state of Texas. This particularly obligates funds, again, so that we can deal with local communities in saving lives during something as devastating and as drastic as a freeze that impacts the inner cities and rural communities drastically. I ask my colleagues to support my amendments that I've just offered, dealing with the safety of other mobility forms, dealing with wastewater, and then dealing with the Natural Hazard Education Response Grant Program and the Safe Drinking Water. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Roy.
Well, thank the chairman. I will be discussing Roy Amendment number 12 and number 234. I'll acknowledge the committee 234 was late. The staff in the room, that was my fault, not my staff's fault. But with respect to Roy Amendment 12, I appreciate the fact that I've got 4 Texans here on the first panel to help me out here a little bit. But this amendment, the purpose of it is to ensure that states receive at least a 95% rate of return on their contribution to total deposits paid into the Highway Trust Fund. And I think as many in the body know, the current law ensures that states receive 95% return on the dollar amount they contribute to the trust fund that's known as the minimum guarantee. But states like Texas and a number of other states, I've got 19 rattled off here, lose out because under this, it does not apply to the general fund transfers that increasingly cover the trust fund shortfall. So our ask for this amendment is that we would get a 95% return on the total contribution to the dollars put in. As many people know, Texas contains more interstate miles, contributes more to the trust fund than any other state, but in many ways we've been shortchanged with respect to the return on those dollars that go in. Other states that receive less than the 95% of the total, Colorado, I noticed some folks in this room, Colorado, North Carolina, South Carolina, Minnesota, Mississippi, Nebraska, Florida, Tennessee, Utah, Arizona, Washington, Ohio, Michigan, Iowa, Maryland, Virginia, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. I think it's time for us to at least revisit that formula. I think some of my colleagues from Texas certainly agree, and I think some of my colleagues from other states that end up with less than 95% would also agree. So, for example, if Texas were guaranteed to receive 95% of the 11.72% it contributed to the Highway Trust Fund pool, Texas would receive an additional $557 million in a year for our needs in Texas. And look, Texas takes a lot of the brunt with respect to USMCA, NAFTA. The traffic coming in through I-35, coming up from Mexico. Obviously, we're dealing with a lot of issues involving border security and immigration, and so we've got a lot of infrastructure needs. And so I would put that out there, not just for Texas, but for the other 19 states. With respect to amendment number 234, I'm sure this will be greeted with unanimous approval from everybody in the room and loud joy. This amendment would strike the $5.7 billion in earmarks from the bill, and member-designated projects. I want to get this correct. From the bill, and instead establish a $5.7 billion fund in the Treasury for the sole purpose of funding the completion of the border wall on the southern border. This bill contains 1,473 member-designated projects, or what I might call earmarks, that will cost nearly $5.7 billion. That's about $4 billion dedicated to Democrat projects, about $1.7 billion dedicated to Republican projects. That includes things like $2 million for the Antioch Bicycle Garden in Antioch, California. I'll be bipartisan in this. It's got $9.4 million for safe streets and sidewalks in Excelsior Springs, Missouri, $557,000 for parking improvement project in Freehold, New Jersey. Federal government's primary responsibility is to defend and secure the border of the United States, or at least one of. And I would just argue that we could do our part if we could take some of those dollars and help Texas do our part to be able to secure the border. Primary and secondary barriers cover only 771 miles of our 2,000-mile border with Mexico. Texas is home to the largest continuous unfenced portion of the border, which is over 600 miles. As many of my colleagues know, the Rio Grande Valley sector in particular is the busiest migrant crossing area and is wide open with only 76 miles of border wall covering that stretch, and it is under siege as we speak. Governor Abbott announced a $250 million down payment on the border from Texas because we're simply put not getting it done. So I would make that, I'd offer both of those amendments, and I thank the committee.
Thank you. Dr. Burgess.
Look, I want to thank, we do have a lot of Texas members on this panel, and it is a good panel. But I particularly want to thank Mr. Roy for bringing the issue of the rate of return back up. It has, since I came to Congress in 2003, this has been an issue, and you've brought forward a very weak part of when we began supplementing the Highway Trust Fund with general revenue dollars. The apportionment of that was not based on the formula that would actually reflect the large contributions of Texas, because we do buy more gasoline almost than any other state. So I'd like to see all of the amendments made in order, Mr. Chairman. I think it was shows the dedication of the witnesses who brought forward their policies for us to consider today. And I'd encourage them all to be made in order, and I'll yield back.
Mr. Perlmutter. You can just screen.
Sorry. Just a quick question. Mr. Brady, on your amendment concerning the railway rehabilitation
Yes, sir.
investment fund. So Colorado, we made a security deposit, the Regional Transportation District, a number of years ago. We paid off the bonds. We want to get our security deposit back. The appropriations has listed that particular fund. It's like $30 million. Your amendment doesn't affect
It does not.
repayment of security deposits.
No, sir. No, we just want to make sure the projects have their permits ahead of time and have the financial backing, so taxpayers aren't on the hook if these really higher risk, like high-speed rail, don't work as promised.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Johnson, you showed us your that road. Where is that? What road is that?
Yeah, it's BIA 3, and so there are 9 tribes in South Dakota. BIA 3, I think, has some mileage both at the Standing Rock Indian Reservation as well as the Cheyenne River. Harold Frazier, the chairman of Cheyenne River, had played a little trick on me. He said, hey, if you're going to Mobridge, take BIA 3. Now, I had no idea, sir, what bad shape it was, but it was the way for Chairman Frazier to have me see with my own eyes how treacherous this stretch of road was. I got to Mobridge and I called him and I said, Mr. Chairman, you played quite a trick on this Wasichu, which is the Lakota word for white man, and he just laughed and laughed because now I know how bad it is, sir.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
I hope you asked for an earmark for that, or a member-designated project, I'm sorry. That'd be the quickest way to help them out. Ms. Fishbach.
And Mr. Chair, might I suggest that being from Minnesota, and we had Prince, who was formerly known as Prince when he took on the symbol, so we could call it formerly known as earmarks. Just a suggestion. But I just wanted to agree with what Dr. Burgess had mentioned, because the rate of return, when I was in the Minnesota Senate, it was always the bane of our existence that we didn't see all that. So I appreciate the rate of return, and also would just like to associate myself with his words regarding the amendments should all be in order. I think we are a better body if everybody gets the opportunity to vote on these things. So I think we should have the opportunity to vote on more amendments on the floor. But I yield back.
Mr. Raskin?
No questions, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Scanlon? No questions. Mr. Morelli? No questions, sir. Mr. Desagne? Mr. Desagne? No? Oh, no question, okay, I get the hand signals. Mr. Neguse? Anybody else have any questions for this panel? Thank you all very much for being here. Thank you. Our next panel is Mr. Pence, Mr. Schweikert, Mr. Perry, Mr. Belarakis, Mr. Graves, and Dr. Burgess. Okay, and I think we're going to begin with Mr. Pence. You can, yeah. No, yeah. You can, yeah. You can even go in the other room if you want. Absolutely. Mr. Pence.
Good afternoon, Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, and to my colleagues, thank you for your time today. I'm going to get straight to the point since infrastructure is so vital to Hoosiers. This April, I introduced bipartisan legislation with my colleague, Representative Henry Cuellar, Amendment 217. This would codify the rural opportunities to use transportation for economic sense, or the Routes Initiative. This program works to ensure that rural communities get their fair share of federal funding through infrastructure. Last Congress, as a member of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, I offered this legislation as an amendment to H.R. 2, the Moving Forward Act. The Routes Initiative is one of my top FY22 appropriations priorities. Historically, this legislation is essential to my district and the Hoosiers I represent because it would strengthen rural America's ability to be competitive when applying for federal funds. Indiana is the crossroads of America. We see billions in commerce come through our state via airports, highways, and railways. My state and countless other rural parts of this country are just as dependent, if not more, on reliable, safe, and updated infrastructure. With your support, we can again recognize the infrastructure needs of our rural communities across the nation where there are actually more miles per population. I come before this committee today to ask you all to consider accepting this common sense legislation as an amendment to H.R. 3684, the Investment Act, and I thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much. Mr. Schweikert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the theme basically is two simple amendments. I believe actually we're in some ways when we talk about infrastructure, we're also talking about present and decades past and not understanding that there's a technology revolution going on around us, particularly in transportation. Many of us understand that the most powerful thing you can do for flowing traffic, air quality, those things, turns out to be technology. The smart cities, how many of you ever use Waze? Things like that, and that's just one little sliver. So I have Amendment 145 and 150. I'd start with 150. It's basically to ask the Transportation Secretary to produce a definition of what smart city is. And part of this idea is, how do I get vehicles that are being tested in my own community right now to be able to talk to stoplights to talk to when an ambulance is dispatched, to know when a school is being let out. So you flow traffic, because it turns out a lot of the data studies right now say one of the greatest things you can do for air quality, for traffic flow, is information, not more pavement. The second amendment, 145, is basically working through a sense of Congress saying, please, we need the ability for data infrastructure to flow back and forth and talk to make the underlying infrastructure of what the smart cities, smart suburbs are going to look like. The reality of it is we're on the cusp of a technology revolution where the delivery to your house may be an autonomous vehicle, where the vehicle that picks up my 5-year-old daughter, when God forbid she ever get a driver's license, will be an autonomous car there where she doesn't drive. To the discussion you had earlier here from one of our members of what does mass transit look like in the future, I will make the argument mass transit in the future are autonomous pods. The revolution of technology is here. But if you go through the transportation bill, we still sound like we're promoting 200-300-year-old technologies. I mean, railroads are 350 years old. We need to start looking to the future. It's a simple sense of Congress, and then get us a definition of what a smart city so we know what we're coding to. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the rest of the committee for your indulgence. I've got a few amendments here, so I'm going to go through them as quickly as I can. Amendment number 11 strikes the earmarks, strikes Section 103 and Section 107 of the underlying bill, which authorizes and allocates funding of earmarks or whatever you want to call them. I think they were banned for a reason, ladies and gentlemen. The period leading up to 2011 earmark ban exposed earmarks as one of the most wasteful and corrupt practices in congressional history. And I know that everybody here wants to do the right thing, and none of us think of ourselves as corrupt or corruptible, but the reality is it happened. From 91 to 2011, Congress included 111,000 earmarks that spent $375 billion in taxpayer funds. In FY10 alone, Congress passed 9,129 earmarks that allocated $16.5 billion in taxpayer monies to parochial. I will say parochial as opposed to pet projects across the country. And understand, the transportation and infrastructure bill and this funding is supposed to be for national needs. We all have individual needs in our district, but they're supposed to be handled individually and district by district as much as possible. This bill alone includes $5.7 billion worth of earmarks, and I think by the time we're done with the appropriation cycle, we'll be outpacing the 2010 level. There's a claim that earmarks will end the Washington gridlock, and I think that's fundamentally an earmark in favor of coercion, for legislation that would otherwise not pass. Moreover, the partisan effort to move the surface reauthorization bill proves this legalized coercion is ineffective to ending such gridlock. I mean, it's going to happen anyhow, but we're going to spend this money. So I'll just dispense with the rest of it and move on to the next one. You get the point. Perry,
you have a lot more confidence in the Biden administration than I do.
Anyway, I'm not saying and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't like the process on either end of it.
Yeah, no, well, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we have an agreement there, at least. Rules Amendment 45 and 46 strikes Section 1211 entitled EV Charging Stations and strikes Section 1303, which establishes a Clean Corridors program to provide formula funding for EV charging and hydrogen fueling infrastructure. I would say the federal funding of electric vehicle charging stations is regressive, it's unfair, and it actually will negatively impact air quality while doing absolutely nothing to impact climate change. The 2018 Manhattan Institute study found that broad-based adoption of what we call zero-emission vehicles, and I would challenge that completely, but they actually increase air pollution and associated environmental costs relative to new internal combustion engine vehicles. Study found that the climate impact of even complete adoption of these vehicles will be non-existent. Even if all vehicles were replaced by zero-emission vehicles, the associated CO2 reduction, less than 500 million tons per year, would be less than half the estimated annual reduction from the Obama-era Clean Power Plan, a proposal that the Obama EPA admitted would have no impact on the world's climate. No impact. That's not me saying that. Public subsidies for EV charging stations are inherently regressive. Those who cannot afford to purchase electric vehicles will see no benefit from such subsidies, but will bear the entire cost as they fund the Highway Transit Fund, Trust Fund for their gas taxes. The exclusive benefit will be to the electric vehicle owner and owners who are significantly wealthier than the average American. In 2017, the Department of Transportation found about two-thirds of households with battery, electric, or plug-in hybrid electric vehicles have incomes higher than $100,000 a year. So these grants are inherently unfair. This provision eliminates the illusion that surface transportation is paid for with the user fees. EV owners pay absolutely nothing. into the Highway Trust Fund, despite the fact that they're heavier and they actually degrade the roads at a much higher rate than average vehicles. Moving on. Amendment 47, high-speed rail prohibition. This amendment prohibits the provision of loans or loan guarantees for high-speed rail projects not in compliance with the FRA Tier 3 safety standards. These are the standards that we set, and we're just saying they shouldn't get these loans or loan guarantees unless they can comply. And it would prohibit the highly controversial Texas Central Railroad high-speed rail project from receiving federal loans or loan guarantees. The project has gone from $10 billion to $30 billion, and it's going to turn it into the next California disaster, only it's in Texas. The company has repeatedly told the public and elected officials that this project would be privately funded. But here they are with their hand out. They're seeking taxpayer dollars. The company continues to face insurmountable hurdles before they can even begin construction on the project, including lacking financial feasibility, lack of eminent domain authority, failure to gain approvals from the Surface Transportation Board, potential safety and flooding issues, and near uniform opposition from local and state officials. There's absolutely no reason that taxpayers across the country, including in your own district, should have to pay for this stuff. Amendment number 90 strikes a carbon pollution reduction program and its apportionment. It strikes Section 1213, which creates a new carbon pollution reduction apportionment program. This program would divert funding from core highway and bridge projects for projects that would lower greenhouse gas emissions, essentially diverting these funds to public transit and intercity passenger rail, despite low levels of ridership. And I think that's really important. The provision that allows states to use up to 10% of their funds for operating costs of public transportation shows the true intent of this program, not to reduce greenhouse gases, but to put the federal taxpayers on the hook for the enormous cost of public transit. Moreover, the greenhouse gas reduction from public transit is a myth. In nearly every city, public transit results in more greenhouse gas emissions than driving. The program also requires states making the least progress in emission reduction to dedicate additional federal funds to projects that will reduce emissions, regardless of anemic ridership, the current level status of states' highways, or the desire of the state's residents to drive. It fails to account for emissions resulting from the transportation of freight to another state, meaning, for instance, the state of Pennsylvania would be forced to divert resources due to emissions from freight going to New York, just because we happen to be in proximity. Moving on. Amendment number 142 repeals Section 13C of the Urban Mass Transportation Act, entitled Employee Protective Arrangements. This amendment repeals Section 13C of the Urban Mass Transportation Act of 1964, which makes the FTA funding contingent upon a certification by the Secretary of Labor that fair and equitable arrangements are made to protect employees from losing benefits or rights against a worsening of their employment positions. While the congressional intent in enacting Section 13C was to maintain the status quo of affected employees, not to improve employee benefits or union positions. In practice, these so-called employee protective arrangements effectively provide transit unions veto power over any potential federal grant to their employer, giving unions unparalleled negotiating leverage to force transit agencies to cave to their demands. I mean, the unions we're going to send them the money, and the unions are going to say no, and all the people here aren't going to have a vote. That's absurd. According to Randall O'Toole at the Cato Institute, transit worker productivity has dropped by nearly 60%, with the number of riders carried per operating employee dropping from 57,000 in 1964 to 24,000 in 2018. I mean, the inflation-adjusted dollars just means that we're paying more for less. I mean, unfortunately, people don't want to admit it, but less people are taking transit. That's just a fact, ladies and gentlemen. And this has had a compounding effect that has left these systems failing prior to the pandemic, when transit agencies were facing $106 billion state of good repair backlog that predated the pandemic. People think, well, this is all pandemic related. It's not. Ridership was going down before the pandemic. They faced $49 billion in unfunded pension and post-employment benefit liabilities, and an 8% drop in nationwide ridership from 2014 to 2019. Again, I think you get the point here. The underlying bill provides $109 billion in transit funding. Unless the issues in 13C are addressed by this amendment or some other amendment, we're just going to be wasting dollars, and the decisions we make here in Congress aren't going to matter because they're going to be made locally by union bosses in your homes and other places. Amendment number 144 prohibits the use of funds for Amtrak network expansion. This amendment prohibits the use of federal funds to expand the Amtrak network beyond the routes stations served by Amtrak on the date of the enactment of this act. The underlying legislation authorizes $32 billion over 5 years for Amtrak service, $13.5 billion for the Northeast Corridor and $18.5 billion for the national network, well beyond previous funding level or even Amtrak's request. More than 3 times higher than Amtrak funding level under the FAST Act. I mean, ladies and gentlemen, the spirit of this is let's have Amtrak fix. And oh, by the way, I live in the Northeast Corridor. It's the only profitable portion of Amtrak. Let's have them fix that before we build more lines that we can't afford, which is exactly what the underlying bill does. So I won't burden you more with more of that. Amendment number 147 strikes the high-density state formula program and reallocates the funds to the general transit formula programs. This amendment eliminates funding for the high-density state apportionment transit program authorized at $277 million and reallocates it to programs that benefit every single state. So to be clear, the high-density state program is effectively a $277 million slush fund for transit system in 7 states: Connecticut, Delaware, Massachusetts, Maryland, New Jersey, New York, and Rhode Island, and the District of Columbia. Funding eligibility under this program is not based on relevant system or state need or ridership levels, for that matter. It's simply based on arbitrary population density formula that diverts highway trust fund monies to 7 East Coast states and the District of Columbia. The eligibility formula clearly demonstrates this program is not a responsible use of taxpayer funds based on need or actual or even potential ridership levels. It's merely just a handout to these locations. This amendment would limit the slush fund and reallocate the funding to the rural and urban formula programs. We already have a program, it goes to rural and urban across the states, and it just makes sure that that $277 million that everybody's going to pay taxes on goes to everybody. Amendment number 151 strikes the Capital Investment Grant Program. For the past decade, the Capital Investment Grant Program has led to the misallocation of funds to the most expensive projects without regard to the project's financial viability or expected ridership. By overextending resources in search of federal grant funding, transit agencies fail to consider the impact this will have on their ability to provide services. While this was true before the pandemic, it's of particular concern in the post-pandemic environment. The FTA data shows that 2020 ridership came in at around 46% of the 2019 levels. So there's little need to build out additions to the transit system before we can ascertain the long-term impact of the pandemic on ridership. Now just keep in mind, people in this room and everybody downstairs provided in excess of $100 billion in annual and emergency spending to public transit agencies over the past 2 fiscal years. Just asking that we wait to see what the impact of that $100 billion was before we give more money to people that don't ride trains. Amendment 153 strikes a mandate on automatic emergency brake systems on new commercial vehicles. An integrated safety system with an automatic emergency braking system can add up to $5,000 to the cost of a single truck. I don't know whether you know this or not, but we can't hire truck drivers. People can't get into trucks because they can't afford them. But the emission system, one repair for one piece costs $8,000. If it's your only truck and you don't have the $8,000, your truck's sitting and you're out of business. Fleets are operating on exceedingly tight margins, as you probably already know. The mandated increase presents a barrier to entry for new market participants. It actually will extend the life of old trucks, as truck drivers can't afford to buy the new ones, so they're going to drive old trucks. And I think probably everybody here would argue that, and rightly so, that would probably be more dangerous. They'll get there, just don't make them. Amendment 155 strikes a section directing FMCSA to initiate rulemaking on screening for obstructive sleep apnea among commercial vehicle drivers. section directs FMCSA to, within 1 year, assess the risk posed by untreated obstructed sleep apnea and initiate a rulemaking to establish screening criteria for obstructive sleep apnea among commercial vehicle drivers. This amendment strikes 4308, which amounts to an overreach, unnecessary federal intrusion into medical certification process that should be performed by a doctor. There's no definitive research that what we're doing now isn't working, and that what you have to know is this sleep apnea that we're going to this test that we're going to put these truck drivers through aren't covered by the vast majority of health insurance policies, and they're expensive. They cost thousands and thousands of dollars. Again, it's just a Washington overreach while we don't have data to support any of the policy. And finally, Amendment 210 strikes speed limits. Now, for a party that seeks to defund the police, I think Democrats seem enthusiastic on policing every element in our lives, including the last two amendments, from the cars we drive, if they couldn't be outlawed outright, to speed limits on highways. So this amendment would strike a provision requiring the Secretary revise the manual on uniform traffic control devices to provide for a safe system approach, which includes vulnerable road users like pedestrians and bicyclists. Most highways I drive on don't allow pedestrians or bicyclists on them. Currently, the standard criteria for setting speed limits is roughly the 85th percentile speed. That is the speed at which about only 15% of drivers would exceed. This is a common used and common sense standard which allows states to make changes to their situation. Speed limits in Utah probably shouldn't be the same as those in Rhode Island. We had a federally mandated speed limit before, and when Congress discussed a repeal of the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, naysayers claimed traffic fatalities would skyrocket. Even Ralph Nader said that history will never forgive Congress for this assault on the sanctity of human life. Well, you know what happened, don't you? We repealed it, and the fatalities actually decreased. That's the end of my amendments, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Bilirakis.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it very much. I have an amendment, and it's a nonpartisan amendment, Disability Licensing and Accessibility Act, and I think that people should have an opportunity to vote for it on the floor. I did not get the opportunity to submit the amendment in committee. So anyway, my amendment will grant much-needed transportation benefits to individuals with disabilities by prohibiting a state from issuing a license for the operation of a highly automated vehicle in a manner that discriminates on the basis of disability. These are defined as those with full autonomy, as defined by the Society of Automotive Engineers as a level 4 or 5. So they're truly self-driving cars. Under my amendment, a manufacturer of a highly automated vehicle will also receive an exemption if it improves the transportation benefits for individuals with disability. These incentives are crucial for Americans with disabilities to reap the technological advancements and mobility that self-driving cars promise to deliver. We must plan ahead. We have to stay ahead of the game. I think each one of us wants to provide transportation benefits to our constituents, especially to those with disabilities. To quote a recent letter sent to you from the National Federation of the Blind that I encourage be made into the record, and I believe Dr. Burgess will be submitting into the record. I quote the National Federation of the Blind: highly automated vehicles have the potential to revolutionize the transportation landscape, especially for individuals with disabilities. However, individuals with disabilities who stand to gain the most from the creation and proliferation of highly automated vehicles could be left out of this new frontier if specific actions are not taken, unquote. In America, Mr. Chairman, we pride ourselves on innovation, ingenuity, and inventiveness. We seek out the most difficult problems and challenge ourselves to do the impossible. We've explored the deepest parts of the ocean, trekked through forests for medicinal cures, and raced to the final frontiers of space and the moon. It is our success in journals like these that set us apart from the rest of the world. So why should leading the world in life-saving and transformational automated technology be any different? Today we find ourselves in this new race. Self-driving vehicles are no longer the dreams of science fiction, not the Jetsons. Science fiction, I'm old enough to remember that. Science fiction, but are the way to the future. It is essential that our nation establishes a framework to test and deploy these vehicles so that we can be a global leader and one day give all Americans, especially those with disabilities, Mr. Chairman, the transportation rights they deserve. I sincerely hope that this amendment is made in order and we have an opportunity to vote on it, and I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I hate to be redundant to the amendments Mr. Perry covered, because I think he covered all of them that have ever been filed in Congress. Thank you, Mr. Perry. Mr. Chairman, I first want to start out by saying I think how this rule is going to move forward, and I have strong concerns about packaging dozens or maybe even more amendments. There were well over 200 amendments filed in this bill, and if you're going to give members of Congress an opportunity to vote on one package, including dozens or maybe even over 100 amendments as we've done over the last year, it really does thwart our ability to represent constituents, and so I'm hopeful that y'all be very thoughtful about that. I understand the time constraints, and I'm sure there's some solutions there would be consistent with the Office of Attending Physician guidance.
It just, we don't decide what goes on block. That's up to the...
I appreciate it, but it very much affects our ability to legislate, and I do think your voice would be listened to more than mine would. But I do want to cover a few of the amendments that we offered. Amendment number 57 is a bipartisan amendment, Mr. Cuellar. It pertains to staged accidents. And in 2019, there was a ring of over 30 people that staged 150 accidents, one of which had a payout in excess of $4.7 million. Let me say that again, 150 staged accidents. There is not a federal law that specifically prohibits this. There's a federal law that prohibits interference, and federal prosecutors in this case, because of how huge it was, they were able to use it. This provides a specific law outlawing staged accidents. Again, this is number 57. It is bipartisan with Mr. Cuellar, and I urge you to allow us to vote on that amendment to make it a federal law that would make this illegal. Amendment number 58 pertains to NEPA, and I'm well aware that NEPA is one of these sacrosanct things that nobody ever wants to touch. But in reality, in practice, Mr. Chairman, and this is what I used to do for a living, build infrastructure projects. Today, for example, the NEPA process takes on average 7 years to carry out an infrastructure project, 7 years. When the law was first created, it took about 1/3 that time period. This results in more money being diverted to non-construction activities. It would result in more efficient application of NEPA. It does not threaten environmental concerns in any way, shape, or form. In fact, it focuses resources and results in a more efficient process. Mr. Chairman, I've probably restored more acres of coastal wetlands than anyone else in the United States. I believe in protecting and restoring our environment. This process thwarts it in many cases, and the reality is the majority of projects carried out across America today are done without applying NEPA because they're done not implicating federal dollars, which in most cases doesn't trigger a NEPA analysis. I urge you to take a look at that one. Number 59 is a bipartisan amendment with Congressman Vicente Gonzalez of Texas. It provides a grant program for autonomous vehicle safety measures and research. As you know, we're moving in an autonomous vehicle direction. There are changes to transportation infrastructure that are needed to maximize the safety capability. Well in excess of over 90% of accidents that occur are the result, have a human factor that led to that crash or that contributed to the crash. So this simply moves in the direction that we are inevitably moving in, but provides a grant program to plan for and to invest in safety measures to allow those autonomous vehicles effectively to communicate or to recognize roadway infrastructure. Number 60 pertains to Section 401, which is in the Clean Water Act. Right Right now, Section 401 has had this evolving interpretation whereby states are using something that is supposed to be states certifying water quality or water discharge implications. And as we've seen across the United States, this provision is being misinterpreted in a way that allows it to be used for things well outside of the bounds of the federal law. It is stopping, shutting down projects that have nothing to do with concerns related to water discharge. This helps to, I think, protect congressional intent and refine the interpretation of 401 and the application in states. I also want to put in a good word for Congressman Garamendi's amendment number 1 on the water bill. It pertains to NPDES permits. Right now, the permits are good for 5 years. Being a practitioner in that space, I can tell you that a 5-year shelf life on these permits is insufficient. His amendment extends it to 10. I think when you go out there and talk to practitioners, they're going to tell you this is a much better time frame based on, again, pre-construction activities and the maintenance activities. I'd urge you to take a look at that. I've got 2 others that I want to highlight. Number 62, I believe I heard Mr. Perry talking about a provision in the underlying bill that says this. It's fascinating. If you look at the top 15 states in America between 2015 and 2019 that reduced emissions in the transportation sector, those 15 states will be designated high-performing states and then can use 100% federal funds to build roads. Right now, the cost share is 80 to 90% federal, depending on the type of road that you're building. This, let me say it again, this looks retroactively at 2015 to 2019 and allows the highest performing states, which this is an earmark. We already know who those states are. It allows them to use 100% federal funds for roads. I think it's unfair. And so if we're seriously concerned about the environment and air quality, we have an amendment that simply says, any state that has 2 or more extreme non-attainment under the Clean Air Act, if you're a non-attainment, have a non-attainment area, you're ineligible. You can't go out there and meet one standard and completely fail in various others. And so it says that states, while I'd love you to strike the whole section of the bill, I think if we truly care about the environment and air quality, then let's care about the environment and air quality, and let's hold states' feet to the fire on non-attainment. So that's number 62. The last one I'll make mention of is another bipartisan amendment with Congressman Carter of Louisiana. And this one establishes a National Resilience Center. Mr. Chairman, I don't have to tell you or anyone in this room, our appropriators, the amount of money that we spend and have spent in recent years on disasters. Mr. Chairman, being a practitioner in this field for a number of years, the investments that we're making, in many cases, are not the ones that maximize return on investment to taxpayers. Things like building standards, things like building materials, water management. This is a direction that I think we are inevitably going to go in. You've heard people from FEMA and otherwise talk about, even Congressional Budget Office, talk about the return on investment or tax savings from making proactive investments in resilience. This is an opportunity to develop the best practices. This is amendment number 99, again, bipartisan amendment, and I urge your consideration of those as well as any other ones that I've offered.
Thank you. And finally, Dr. Burgess.
And, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do have several amendments that I would ask the Rules Committee to consider making in order. The first amendment, number 125, very similar to what Mr. Schweiker talked about as far as streamlining, but perhaps just a little bit more specificity because this strikes sections 1403 of the bill. That would set a national emission standard. Look, I think we've learned through experience that innovation rather than regulation is it's going to, as a greater yield on return on investment. Look, I sat through the Energy and Commerce Committee when we debated the Waxman-Markey bill back in 2009, passed this House by a couple of votes, never got heard over in the Senate, so it never became law. But all these years later, the actual reduction in carbon emissions is greater now with the improvements that we have made in the technology of energy production than would have been achieved with the Waxman-Markey bill. So this Amendment 125 to strike Section 1403 is a recognition that innovation as opposed to regulation is going to have a greater return on investment. Amendment number 130, this amendment requires the Secretary of Transportation to report to Congress on the use of forced labor practices in the mining or processing of critical minerals or the use of such minerals in manufactured products within the transportation sector. Look, it goes without saying that we want to adopt new technologies, but this should not come at the cost of sacrificing an historic commitment to human rights. And I encourage the committee to make that amendment in order. Amendment number 140, this amendment would ensure that no federal funds would be spent on clean corridor programs that are already covered by electric utility ratepayers. This bill establishes the underlying bill establishes a $1 billion per year clean corridors program to provide formula funding to states for electrical vehicle charging and hydrogen fueling infrastructure. But as it is currently written, Section 1303 of the Invest in America Act allows electric utilities to use federal funds to pay for electric vehicle charging stations that are already financed by increasing electrical rates on their ratepayers. So this practice is often called rate basing and requires all electricity users to pay for the charging infrastructure used by only a small segment of customers. In other words, we are asking everyone who uses electricity in this country and pays a utility bill to pay for toys for rich people. Amendment number 149. This amendment requires the Transportation Secretary to consider how using the electrical utility ratepayer funds for electric vehicle charging infrastructure would negatively impact the investment of private capital into that same infrastructure. In other words, we're making a federal investment, we're displacing private capital. That is not the business that the government should be, where the government should be involved. And my amendment simply ensures that private investments are considered prior to providing funding under the Clean Corridor Program. Amendment number 190, this amendment increases the cap on private activity bonds from $15 billion to $45 billion. Private activity bonds, as most of us know, are a type of municipal bond issued for transportation projects and secured by revenue generated by the product financed with the bonds. Congress authorized the use of tax-exempt private activity bonds for selected transportation projects, which must be approved by the Secretary of Transportation. Under current law, the aggregate amount of private activity bonds must not exceed $15 billion. As of December 2020, just over $13 billion had been issued and $1.7 billion had been allocated. And this type of tax-exempt bond is an important tool for financing major infrastructure projects. Look, I represent one of the fastest growing areas in the country in North Texas. Constituents that may benefit from these projects should also have the ability to invest in their local infrastructure through the use of these private activity bonds. I would myself put a portion of my retirement activity into a private activity bond if I knew it was going to return a certain rate of return and it was going to be tax deferred, if I knew that I was paying for the infrastructure for the next generation. So this is a common sense amendment to expand the private activity bonds from $15 to $45 billion, and I urge that that amendment be made in order as well. I want to speak on the Wahlberg Amendment, number 229. This amendment adds the term mode of transportation to criteria for collection of data on traffic stops. More than 30 million Americans are estimated to operate a motorcycle annually, representing 10% of the population. Motorcyclists account for a significant portion of road accidents. As the co-chair of the Motorcycle Caucus with Representative Wahlberg, I want to support riders through education and awareness. This amendment will simply add the mode of transportation to the data that is collected during routine traffic stops. This data will bring greater transparency as to how motorcyclists are being treated, how they behave on our roadways, and I recommend that the amendment be made in order. And finally, I want to speak on Mr. Graves' amendment number 58, the Builder Act. And as Mr. Graves has already eloquently articulated, the length of time it takes to get the approval to build a federal project has made so many projects literally out of reach of our ability to fund them, and we simply must quit wasting our time spending years or decades on studying projects and ensure instead that they are actually completed. Actually, I just wanted to speak very, very briefly. Chip Roy brought amendment number 12 to our attention, increasing the rate of return for the Highway Trust Fund. And that is a critically important amendment, and I do want to encourage that it be made in order as well. And then it's not actually an amendment, but I do have a statement for the record by Mr. Guest of Mississippi, and I'd ask unanimous consent that Mr. Guest's statement be made part of the record.
Without objection.
And I yield back.
I want to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record a statement by Mr. Swazi in support of his amendment. Without objection. Mr. Cole, any questions?
No, I just quickly say I like all the amendments, hope they're made in order, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks. Mr. Bilirakis, your amendment on the licensing of folks with disabilities. So did you or have you proposed this amendment to Transportation and Infrastructure? You said you weren't.
Well, I wasn't given the opportunity to propose it to my committee, the Energy Economy.
So if you were to be, take the other side, why would we not want to have your amendment made in order? I know. But give me the best reason why not, because I understand energy.
No explanation. It's a no-brainer. We have to plan for this, and there are a lot of areas in the country that do not have public transportation. And I know that the elderly, more people that have issues, disability issues, or I think in 10 years I probably will have to use a self-driving car. 4 or 5, meaning that we would not have to operate a steering wheel or what have you. So I think that we need to pass this bill to be ahead of the game and make sure that we're not discriminating against the elderly or anyone with a disability.
I have a daughter
so that
with
they have access to self-driving cars.
I have a daughter with epilepsy, and she's never been able to get a license over all these years. And eventually, she hadn't had a seizure for about 6 or 7 years. So she could, under Colorado law, if she applies for a license, get one. But the autonomous driving vehicles really are attractive in this situation. So I appreciate your amendment. Mr. Schweikert?
Thank you, sir.
Your amendments on smart cities, is there some opposition to having smart cities as part of this bill?
Look, we have to deal with the reality of the technology, the smart cities, does start to change the discussion of moving traffic from building more, laying more asphalt, concrete, to using of technology. So will it be seen as a threat? I don't know, but on a conceptual level, yes.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Burgess, you want to question yourself?
I do. I have extensive questions. Actually, I want Mr. Perry to go through his list again, just in case I missed something. Just kidding. But I do want to say on the smart city side, it's a yes and answer. I mean, yes, there are critical projects that we need. You're a high growth area, I'm a high growth area. We both recognize that, but there's no reason in the world that they can't be constructed smartly and in order to maximize that, maximize the innovation. And then, Mr. Bilirakis, I apologize. You said that I was going to introduce something for the record.
It should be here. I gave it to staff, and then what it is a statement of support from the National Association.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to insert a statement in the record for support
Without
for Mr.
objection.
Bilirakis. I yield back.
Ms. Scanlon. Ms. Okay. Ms. Fishbach.
Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Morelli. Mr. DeSagne.
I have no questions, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank Ms. Ross. Mr. Neguse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have one question with respect to Mr. Perry for the member-designated project amendment that you proposed. And I guess what I'm wondering, I understand your philosophical opposition to it, but I presume you would concede the point that I think was made earlier, that as a practical matter, in effect, these member designated projects ensure that Congress is deciding as opposed to the president. So, for folks back in Pennsylvania, ultimately, this money will be spent either at the direction of Secretary Buttigieg, who's President Biden's Secretary of Transportation, or by this Congress with your input and your insight into what would work best in places like Harrisburg and others. And so I guess I just wonder where you land on that, because that seems inconsistent with the amendment.
No, I think that the system and the process is ineffective and inefficient. And while I grant you that having the administration making the decisions is not in keeping with, I think, the intent or the spirit of what we're trying to accomplish here, and certainly not in keeping with what I'd like to accomplish, I think the fact that acting like that this doesn't have the detrimental effect that it does is kind of sticking your head in the sand. And I think that there's a sweet spot in the middle, but we refuse to get to it, where the states are allocated a certain amount of funding for their different, whether it's surface, whether it's transit, you name it, and that's the allocation, and they spend it the best way that they see fit. Allocating it by, if you want to call it earmark or member-directed spending or what have you, has a whole lot of there's a whole lot of subtleties there that I don't think we want to acknowledge, like how long someone has been here, what their position, if you're a committee chairman, if you're the committee chairman, and the influence you have. Those type of things all have an impact, and I would say that whether you're a citizen who is represented by a freshman, someone who just got elected, or someone who's been here for 20 years, you don't deserve any less representation, but yet that's what we see. So I agree with you that there are imperfections on the other side of the equation. I don't think this fixes those imperfections or these imperfections.
And I would just say, I appreciate your argument. I certainly want to disabuse anyone of the notion or reassure you that the inconsistencies you referenced with respect to the member designated projects don't exist in this case. I mean, I've only been in Congress for 2.5 years. We secured more in member designated project funding than many members who have served for a lot longer. The member designated projects that are within this bill are, incredibly important projects to my constituents, to the Democrats on this committee, to the Republicans on this committee. There's about, I think, $17 million worth of money to expand I-35 in Oklahoma, the ranking member. Important project to him and to the people that I know he represents, and to many others here. So I appreciate the argument with respect to that amendment, but I guess we'll leave it there. With that, I yield back.
No, and let me just say, I want to associate myself with your remarks. I know President Biden won Pennsylvania, so you have confidence in him making the decisions as to where the projects should go, and you have a Democratic governor who I'm sure you trust him to decide where those monies go. I mean, I have a Republican governor in Massachusetts, and he's a nice guy, but I don't trust his judgment over my judgment as to what my city needs or what my towns need. And I think in terms of the appropriations process, it's a pretty even a split in terms of, I mean, the idea of, like, if you're the chairman, you can get $1 gazillion. That's not reality anymore. So I just point that out for the record. But anyway, any other questions of this panel? Thank you very much for your patience and for being here. You're dismissed. The next panel is Mr. Nails, Ms. Kamak, Mr. Trone, and Mr. Smith. Okay, so Mr. Nails will begin with you.
That would be fine, thank you.
Is the little light on? Otherwise, it doesn't work.
the Oklahoma chief of police talking about his city and encouraging his city council not to defund his operation. He had the 5 stars on his shoulders. He's been given the enormous amount of the responsibility to take care of the residents in that great city of Oklahoma. And he was encouraging that city council, please, don't defund the police. You're going to make my job much, much more difficult. And it was a very impassioned speech. I kind of felt for him. I did law enforcement. I worked in it for 30 years, 8 years as a county sheriff. And so this is what we're seeing in cities across our country. We're seeing it not only in Oakland, you're seeing it in Seattle, you're seeing it in Baltimore, you're seeing it in all sorts, Seattle. You're seeing it in cities across our country. And my amendment is just plain, clear and simple. It says that to those municipalities that have chosen to defund their police, Austin, $150 million. It was 33% of their entire budget. Why would we then allow those same cities the ability to get millions of dollars grant funding from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration? Why would we allow that? It's almost like, okay, this hand here is we're going to take away millions of dollars from your police department, the city of New York. But yet in this hand, I'm going to go ask the federal government for millions of dollars to augment the police. It makes no sense to me whatsoever. I think it's a nonpartisan issue. It's just, you can't endorse the idea of police agencies and municipalities being defunded by these city councils, and then on the other hand say, well, go out and apply for a few grants because the federal government throws money at everything and we'll just get some money out of that pocket. Makes sense. It just makes no sense. I mean, there's been conversations, and I don't know if my graphs are here. I should have had some graphs here, but it just doesn't make any sense. There's been conversations as it relates to definitions of defund the police, and it's quite clear what the definitions are. It's taking millions of dollars out of law enforcement budgets. So I would ask this committee here to reconsider that amendment. I know we had a passionate conversation on the floor a month or so ago during that 17-hour marathon, but I would ask for some consideration on that amendment. And the last amendment, and I wish I would have known as a junior member, I had a display board, and it relates to amendment number 34, and it's clear view font. The state of Texas, are we not allowed that, Mr. Chairman, to have a board that I could?
Well, it's a longstanding
rule. It just would make things so much easier. Could I get some consideration? It's just, it shows a street sign is what it is. No?
Is that, I mean, I'm like, I mean, we have a precedent up here. We don't
Okay.
do that. I mean,
All right.
So, I mean, but if it's.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, if we'll make his amendment in order, he can bring his poster board to the floor of the House
Okay.
and share it with all of us.
Well, let me just say
and
this.
I'm dying to see it.
Let me say this. The state of Texas, for those members, and it was 17 hours. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, and we didn't want to sit there for 21 hours, so I didn't get to this amendment. But this is real plain and simple. What it is there's somebody from the Federal Highway Administration wants to tell Texas and states, 20 other states across the union, what type of font their highway signs should look like. Right now, the font is Clearview font. It's in 20 states. It's in the state of Texas. Ranking member, I think Oklahoma uses Clear font. It's been in existence for years. Many people have analyzed it, from smart guys, all sorts of other people. And now there's someone in the Federal Highway Administration who says, we need to go change the font of that sign. You're talking about thousands of man-hours, millions of dollars to change the font. The state of Texas, we have signs everywhere on every highway you can imagine. I can't imagine the work that it would take to put a cherry picker in the middle of I-10 at 3 o'clock in the morning, shut down 2 lanes of traffic, so somebody can get on up there and take this H that has a different font versus a different font. It makes no sense to me whatsoever. I just figured when you come up here, the federal government would have more important business and higher priorities than telling the state of Texas, those thousands upon thousands of signs you have along your roads in the great state of Texas need to be changed because we feel we don't like the font. ladies and gentlemen, I say we got to have more common sense and logic than that. I did not get the opportunity to offer this amendment, but I would like if there's anybody that would have a question on that, because the state of Texas is going to be spending a lot of taxpayer dollars on yard sign or signs across the highway if something like this would get enacted.
Thank you. Ms. Kamek.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing and allowing us to participate in this process. I'm speaking to you today on amendment number 195 to provide an exemption for livestock haulers to current hours of service regulations for the last 150 air miles to their final destination. Mr. Chairman, since last year, livestock haulers have been temporarily exempted from hours of service requirements thanks to an emergency declaration from the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. Now, throughout this period, haulers have transported cattle safely and efficiently. The exemption has helped producers to continue to provide beef to U.S. consumers during what has been an unprecedented time for our nation's food supply chain. Now, despite this temporary exemption, a permanent solution for our livestock haulers and cattle producers is urgently needed. Current statute exempts livestock haulers from hours of service requirements within 150 air miles of the source or beginning location of their haul. Now, this exemption is a partial solution that allows haulers to take additional time to drive safely and slowly and handle with care the livestock that they are transporting. However, the destination, whether it be a feed yard, a pasture, processing facility, can often be just as remote. Coming from a cow-calf state like Florida, this is particularly important to my state, my district, and really the Southeast. So we see time and time again that processing facilities have long lines and require careful and slow handling of animals. Now, speaking as a Floridian, I understand better than most how a lack of flexibility in hours of service requirements can jeopardize animal welfare and the success of our producers in the long run. Cattle is just one of Florida's many important exports to other states. It's typically an 8-hour journey just to transport cattle from our producers in South Florida all the way to the north end of the state before continuing onward to destinations in the Midwest and elsewhere. In fact, Florida is home to the largest cow-calf operation in the country. For the health and welfare of cattle in transit, livestock haulers need flexibility in hours of service requirements on both the front and back end of their journey to get cattle out of Florida and transported to their destinations safely and efficiently. Allowing for more flexibility for our livestock haulers within hours of service allows for the safe transport of the livestock as well as the driver and everyone else on the road. Hauling live animals is simply not the same as hauling a trailer full of toilet paper. However, both have been vital during this pandemic. The additional flexibility has helped to ensure the continued success of our nation's livestock industry, food supply, and by extension, national security. My amendment today would also help prevent situations where haulers simply, quote unquote, run out of time and are forced to stop with fully loaded animals in 90-degree plus heat for a full 10 hours before completing their haul. This is simply not feasible, safe for when you are hauling live animals. Mr. Chairman, I urge you and your colleagues to allow debate on this amendment on the House floor, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Trone. I think you got to unmute. Mr. Trone, can you hear us? We can't hear. So, Mr. Trone, why don't we, yeah, we can't hear you. I can see the hand gestures, but I can't, all right. Why don't we, we'll come back to you, okay? We're gonna go to Mr. Smith, and then we'll come back to you.
You hear me now?
Oh, yep, I can hear you now. So why don't you, okay, there you go.
We got a new staffer that's gonna get a promotion.
Okay.
And the other guy, not so much.
All right.
Chairman McGovern and Ranking Member Cole, thank you for the opportunity to speak support of my amendment, the Invest Act. In 1965, this body made a straightforward promise to the people of rural Appalachia. We will connect you to the interstate highway system and the economic benefits that follow. It's been 70 years now, and that promise is still not fulfilled. We've never been closer to finishing the Appalachian Development Highway System, or the ADHS. Just 300 miles left. And this critical work is done. My amendment would provide a little over $1 billion to complete the ADHS. This is a once-in-a-lifetime investment. It will finish Route 219 and ensure Western Maryland has access to new economic opportunities. My constituents in Cumberland, Frostburg, Grantsville, and Friendsville, they deserve this investment. I urge my colleagues to join me in fulfilling the promise to finish the Appalachian Development Highway System. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Cole and members of the committee, ranking member. I'm asking today that amendment number 175, Heidi's Law, be made in order to this bill. On March 31st, 2014, Heidi Bennett, a resident of Freehold, New Jersey, and my constituent, was killed in a horrific accident on US Route 9 when a commercial truck slammed into the back of her car while she was sitting at a red light. A full medical examination revealed that the driver had operated the vehicle while under the influence of methadone and Xanax, a deadly combination which mimics the effects of heroin when combined. Under current law, the DOT, per the mandatory guidelines for the Department of Health and Human Services, administers a 5-panel test when it conducts drug testing for commercial drivers. The 5 substances currently tested for are marijuana, cocaine, amphetamines, opiates, and PCB. The current 5-panel test, however, does not include methadone. However, the Federal Motor Carriers Safety Administration Medical Examiner's Handbook makes clear that methadone is not an allowable drug for operators of commercial motor vehicles. And they also point out that the examiner should not certify the driver if he or she uses or is found to have methadone, regardless of the reason for the prescription. So it is very dangerous. 18-wheelers are out there. You don't want people who are on methadone who have been able to evade any kind of detection, which, again, the Motor Carriers Administration makes very clear in their handbook ought to be included. So this amendment is to try to correct that oversight. I worked for 2 years with HHS and with the administrator, Raymond Martinez, at the Federal Motor Carrier Administration, and we thought we were very close to getting a rule that would finally put methadone into this mix. So again, the trucks on our roads are less dangerous to others and to themselves. COVID-19, I think, just knocked everything out. This initiative was backed by the immediate past president of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, Helen Whitty, and because of the obvious reason, you want to save lives, make sure that those truck drivers are not. So the bottom line, it expands the opiate category in those 5 on the list of substances authorized for testing to include methadone, plain and simple.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cole.
Thank you. Just quickly, I support all the amendments, particularly Mr. Smith's amendment, which I think is really a matter of importance in terms of public safety. And then where Mr. Trone is, where Mr. Nels is concerned, I want to see that chart, Mr. Chairman. So I think we ought to make this amendment in order so we got a chance to get a national display. Yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do not have a question for the panel, but I do have some comments for the general bill, if it's appropriate to give them now.
It is.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we continue to work on the Invest Act, it is important that we keep in mind how transportation infrastructure is literally the foundation that allows our communities to thrive. Millions of Americans across this country are just one public transit ride away from work, school, medical appointments, and from spending time with their friends and family. But millions more are not, because they live in communities where that infrastructure simply doesn't exist. It is clear to see that Americans who live in communities without these investments are at a disadvantage compared to those is included in this bill. It puts authorization for the from 2 million to 8 million, bringing it in line with my bill, the Fair Transportation Act. We've also heard
No, Ms. Torres, you're coming.
About neighborhoods being on the right or wrong side of the tracks, but more. You there?
Yeah, your voice is going in and out. I think we have a bad connection.
I apologize. Committee room. Is that a little better?
That's better.
Okay. So we've heard the phrase about neighborhoods being on the right or wrong side of the tracks, but more accurate description would focus on whether a community is lucky enough to have tracks at all. So my amendment is an acknowledgement that transportation projects can help a community move out of poverty, and I'm glad that it is included. And keeping our focus on equity in the 21st century, we need to acknowledge that infrastructure is more than roads and bridges. It's access to reliable high-speed broadband too. The digital divide is real, and we must work to ensure that every American can access the internet. And that's why I included an amendment directing GAO to prepare a report on broadband accessibility and federal assisted housing. My amendment directs the GAO report on which units have access to broadband and which do not, which units are capable of supporting broadband and which should need retrofitting. These provisions are just two examples of how the INVEST Act advances equity across the country while investing in our people. And I'll give you just one more. My home community in California's Inland Empire has some of the worst air quality in the country. Local winds blow smog from Los Angeles to the Inland Empire. It settles over our region, leading to unsafe air and adverse health effects like asthma and even heart disease. That is why I offer an amendment raising the authorizing amount for regional infrastructure accelerators from 12 million to 13.6 million. The provision also includes them to prioritize projects that improve air quality in areas with the worst air quality in the nation, communities like mine. So what does that mean? That means that no longer our lives will be at risk and people will be healthier. So these are two amendments that were included in this bill. But there's one provision that has no place among all others, because while so much of this bill will create jobs, the so-called Buy America provision will cost jobs. It doesn't encourage the use of American goods, as the name implies. It picks winners and losers in the process, and it actually moves the goalpost as to how we define American-made steel. And I got thousands of jobs at California Steel in my district that hang in the balance as a result of these arbitrary semantics. And to be clear, California Steel qualifies under the Buy American provision in our laws designed to encourage domestic production. But under the provision in this bill, it does not. That's because this isn't about choosing good steel over bad. It's about picking some steel companies on the East Coast, in the Midwest, over others elsewhere in our country. Choosing favorites among production models may help some American workers, but the problem is it will harm American workers too. And I hope that we can talk about how to make this work. So let's stay focused on paving the way to a brighter future for this country and for the American people. That means passing the INVEST Act. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Smith, Chairman Smith, I think you've taught me something this afternoon. I was not aware that a screening test for opiates for a person who's applying for a commercial driver's license would not reveal the presence of methadone. I would think that opiates would, as a class, would be reflected in that person's test results, but that does not happen?
That does not happen. Matter of fact, the widow did a great deal of research himself because the truck driver tested positive with cat and then found he had gone through this battery test and it didn't show up. I contacted HHS. Turn my you're going to get us all in trouble. Okay. I had contacted HHS feeling, let's try to do this administratively if we could, and Dr. Eleanor McCants-Katz, Assistant Secretary for Mental Health and Substance Abuse. We had several meetings with her, and it was almost like, a wow moment. It was not being detected. And so she agreed and was working towards coming up with a rule that would finally get methadone tested. And then COVID hit, and I would call, I introduced the bill hoping that, well, if we can't get it done administratively, we could require it, because a lot of our assumptions were it would be captured, but it was not being captured at all.
Well, and these very expensive tests that are being done on people that reveal all kinds of substances, and with all the money that we've appropriated for that, we're not detecting methadone on a screen. That's pretty incredible, and I hope the amendment is made in order. I hope we get a chance to resolve it today, but I will also commit to you that, this does fall within my other committee's jurisdiction, and we should fix this. I've been concerned for some time about the fact that we are confusing the situation. Marijuana has been legalized in a number of locations. We know that 0.08 for ethanol is the legal limit of impairment, but we have no way of knowing degree of impairment with a qualitative test for marijuana, which doesn't quantitate, and then a quantitative test for ethanol, how that impairs a person's ability to operate a very powerful motor vehicle. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in this space. I hope your amendment is made in order today. I think that's a great first step, but I'll just commit to working with you on the authorizing side to see if we can't get some answer to that.
Thank you so very much for that.
And then Sheriff, you had, I'm presuming you had hearings leading up to this bill in the Committee on Transportation Infrastructure? Or just in the base bill? You had hearings, right?
Mic on?
Yes, sir. It was a 17-hour marathon hearing. We had an opportunity to talk about that Amendment 260 with the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, the millions of dollars. I think last year was up to $160 million that our law enforcement agencies across the country are eligible for. And I believe that agencies, and I did it as a county sheriff, participated in it, but if you're going to defund your law enforcement agency, city councils and such, doing such, defunding, I don't think they should be going to this other hand and getting some of that federal grant money to supplement. It makes no sense.
And I completely agree with you. I trust that amendment will be made in order, but I'm also intrigued by the font issue that you brought up for us. How is the font different? Just describe it. I know a picture's worth 1,000 words.
I don't know. I don't know if you can see that, but can anybody see that? Is there a screen? Can you? I mean, it's a highway sign. They're highway signs. This here is the clear view, and this is some type of Gothic font, if everybody wants to look at it. Now, can you imagine I-10, 45, picture your busy states, Mr. Raskin, and your great state where you're from, where they don't like this font that's been in existence for 20 years in 20-something states, and they're telling Texas, you can't have that. You got to go to this font over there. I'm like, what the hell's the difference?
I'm hard-pressed.
But this is what people are thinking when they have too much time on their hands. And I just don't think, it's going to cost, to shut down a road, to change a sign that's over a highway, you're going to need a cherry picker, you're going to need 6 cop cars, you're going to have to shut it down for a mile to go out there and change it at midnight so you don't get anybody killed. And that's about as nonpartisan as you can get. But I don't know who comes up with these ideas, but this is an opportunity for this committee to save Texas and 19 other states a whole lot of headache and a lot of money, wasting a lot of money because somebody didn't like the font on a sign.
But let me just ask you, presumably, you're describing the 17-hour markup on the bill, the base bill, but you had hearings leading up to the bill being heard in a markup.
Yes.
And did you have testimony from witnesses who said, without this change in the font, there's going to be incalculable death and destruction because we've not changed our font?
Well,
Was
no,
there an expert?
I don't know who this individual is that come up with the idea, but the TxDOT, the Texas Department of Transportation, they don't see any need for this. There's been studies. This has been in existence for years by smart people, the people that understand, I guess, psychology. What does that sign mean? Can you read it correctly? Can it help senior drivers versus young drivers? There have been no problems with these signs in our great state, and we have more roads, I think, than the two other largest states in the union combined. So I don't understand why sometimes it feels that the federal government wants to get to this level and tell states like Texas and 19 or 20 others what kind of signs you can have with font. We have more important things to do.
I don't disagree. I'm just mystified as to how that would be, how would someone justify that in your authorization hearing? I mean, Tom's a valuable appropriator, so he doesn't have to get his hands dirty with, but we're authorizers. And we're
Fantastic.
supposed to dig deep into these issues and
That's great.
understand them and evaluate the data. I'm missing something here.
Yeah, I didn't get an opportunity to offer that amendment because it got to be too long, so I pushed it. But here I am, and I'd be more than happy to reach out more to you and discuss this issue. But
Well, Mr. Chairman, the only solution I see is to make both these gentlemen's amendments in order, and I look forward to us doing that. And I yield back.
Thank the panelists, yield back.
Ms. Fishbach.
Mr. Chair, I am just going to yield back because we don't want to make this any longer than we need to.
Mr. Raskin.
No questions, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Scanlon.
It's not worth turning their mic on. I was just asking whether Comic Sans
yeah,
was.
well, what many states are using, the state of Texas for the past several years, is Clearview. And this individual from the Federal Highway wants to change it to Highway Gothic.
As long as it's not Comic Sans, I think we're okay. I'll yield back.
All right.
Mr. Morelli. Mr. DeSagne.
I have no questions, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Ross. Mr. Neguse. Anybody else? Mr. McCall.
Just quickly, I just want to point out something that does cause me some concern, and there was a Bloomberg article today that suggested that on average about twice as much money was going to Democratic states as Republican states and districts, and I don't know if that's true. It's an interesting article. I read it actually twice today.
Well, let me just say, we're not getting enough in Massachusetts, so whatever it is.
Marion County.
But, it's just worth pointing that out. I think if we have imbalance of that magnitude, then it's going to cause us some problems on the floor because these things really ought to be pretty uniform. In the old days, Mr. Chairman, as I know you'll recall, you used to actually assign members so much money per district. And I know in our case, we just always worked with the Oklahoma Transportation Department. You tell us where it makes sense for this money to go. We weren't out building roads to nowhere. But something like that approach maybe needs to come back if indeed the discrepancy is that big. I suspect LB should get it into the record here because it does cause me great concern in terms of the bill. That yield back, Mr. Chairman.
No other questions. The panel is dismissed. Thank you very much. There anybody else want to testify on HR 3684? Seeing none, that closes the hearing portion on HR 3684. The chair will now entertain a motion from the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. DeSagne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move the committee provide for further consideration of R 3684, the Invest in America Act, under a structured rule. The rule provides the following debate. Each further amendment printed in the Rules Committee report not earlier considered as part of amendments en bloc pursuant to subsection B shall be considered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read. It shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent, and the opponent may be withdrawn by the proponent at any time before the question is put thereon. Shall not be subject to amendment and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule provides that at any time after debate, the chair of the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure or he or his designee may offer amendments printed in the committee report and not earlier disposed of amendments in block shall be considered as read. Shall be debatable for 20 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the chair and the ranking minority member of the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure or their designee. Shall not be subject to amendment and shall not be subject to a demand for a division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against amendments printed in the Rules Committee report or amendments in block described in subsection B. The rule provides that it shall be in order without intervention of any point of order to consider concurrent resolutions providing for adjournment during the month of July. The rule provides that provisions of Section 202 on the National Emergencies Act shall not apply during the remainder of the 117th Congress to a joint resolution terminating the national emergency declared by the President on March 13th of 2020. Finally, the rule provides that the House Resolution 188 agreed to on March 8th, 2021 is amended by striking quotes July 1, 2021, close quotes, each place it appears, and inserting July 20th, 2021, end quotes. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. You heard the gentleman from California. Is any discussion or any amendments? Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the rule. My amendment would eliminate proxy voting in the House. Mr. Chairman, proxy voting was implemented in the House purportedly, and not purportedly, due to the COVID pandemic and the need for the House to continue its work on behalf of the American people. And while I have absolutely no doubts about the intention of the chairman's implementation of this process, it's beyond time, in my opinion, for the House to repeal these procedures necessitated by the pandemic. The rules allowing proxy voting require members to certify that they are unable to physically attend, quote, due to the ongoing public health emergency, unquote, but both sides have abused this process. Democrats have cast proxy votes so they could attend events with President Biden in their home states. Republicans have cast proxy votes so that they could attend political conferences. In my view, both sides are guilty of this. We need to get back to the normal House operations, and there's no reason we need to continue to allow proxy voting in the House under the guise of the need for a public health emergency, and here's why. The latest data show that the average number of new COVID cases for the entire United States is 3.21 per 100,000. The attending physician has stated that masks are no longer required on the floor for members or in committee. Every member of Congress has had the opportunity to take a vaccination. There are only 4 states which have any COVID-19 restrictions: Hawaii, New Mexico, Oregon, and Washington. With the transportation bill on the floor this week and the appropriations bills right around the corner, we shouldn't be considering massive en bloc amendment packages because we're doing 20-minute votes to allow for proxy voting. Eliminating proxy voting would allow the House to reinstate 5 or even 2-minute votes in preparation for the infrastructure package before us and our consideration of appropriations bills later this month and next month. In short, it would restore the power of all rank-and-file members to ask for votes on amendments that are important to them. Ultimately, as vaccination levels continue to rise, this is one more important step forward for the House as an institution, but also to reinstill confidence in the American people that Congress is here to work. As the Majority Whip said in the colloquy on Friday, he hoped that, quote, we would return to regular order shortly after the July 4th holiday. I heartily concur with the Majority Whip's statement. Given that statement, could the chairman inform the committee, why we need to continue the ability for members to vote proxy? And again, I would urge the adoption of the motion.
Thank you very much. I would urge a no vote on this. Look, things are still pretty complicated, and we're trying to rely on the best medical advice. We have some members who have complicated health situations, and I'll point out for the record that many Republicans still utilize proxy voting, and I would just say to my Republican friends that I think they need to keep their messaging straight, because just hours ago, one of your members said that you'd bring up a bill to keep immigration restrictions to the end of the pandemic emergency because, they don't think it's safe to have immigration restored back to normal. And so, the same member is trying to end the pandemic emergency, but he's using the pandemic to justify not allowing immigration into this country. So yeah, absolutely.
Well, it's a little bit of an apples and oranges comparison. I think there is a big difference between the rate of vaccination in the United States and, frankly, we're in almost every other
Depending on
country
what
in the world.
state, depending on what state you look at.
No, almost any place in the United
And
States
it's-
is better than just about any place in Central and South America. So I really don't think
I would say that
situation.
we're all not where we should be. And so I would, again, I would urge a no vote on this. And
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah.
If I may speak to the Cole Amendment. Look, we have done ourselves no favors by putting so many things in block and then voting. We as legislators should be allowed that fine discriminatory touch to vote for or against something as reflecting the will of our district. That's why we're sent here, to represent the congressional districts across this great country. And look, 2-minute votes, hassle, you got to keep up with it, you got to stay on your toes, you blink, you miss one, and you hate that that happened, but that is far preferable to jamming everything into an en bloc amendment or an en bloc suspension. We're given no ability, just as a case in point, we just came from the floor where we voted, one of the bills dealt with someone who's being held inappropriately in the country of Iran. And how do you vote against that? But in order to vote to free that person, you got to vote for everything else that was crammed into that en bloc. It's not fair. It was never intended for us as representatives to have that tool that lacks discrimination. Mr. Cole is right. We need to go back to pre-pandemic activities. The time is right. Vaccination rates are correct. Let us do this and demonstrate to the American people why it is worthwhile to proceed with the vaccination program. And I yield back.
well, if the gentleman is referring to the suspension calendar, for whatever reason, your members insist on asking for a vote on every single one of them, which means we would never get anything done around here. And so, you know what?
That is their right.
It is their right, but at some point, we have to behave like a legislative body and all grow up. And when that happens, you know what? I'll be the first one to say, let's go back to normal. But until then, I'm not, you know what? I didn't come here to spend, hours and hours and hours voting on suspension bills in roll call fashion, renaming a post office, or something that would normally get, almost a unanimous vote, just so that people can delay the process.
It's hardly trivial that we were voting on freeing someone who's being held inappropriately.
No, I'm just simply saying that you're asking me why we have en bloc voting authority for suspension.
We could go to 2-minute votes, Mr. Chairman.
I'm telling you why. And there are a lot of Republican suspension bills that we're moving forward as well. And unfortunately, they've been subjected to some of the dilatory tactics by your own members. So I'm just simply saying that, there's a way to move forward here, but it would be helpful if there's a little bit of cooperation. Ms. Fischbach.
Mr. Chair, our job is to vote. And so we should be proud to cast each of those individual votes so that the people in our district know what we are voting.
Well, we are voting. We are voting, but I mean.
But when there's so many, as Dr. Burgess was mentioning, there are so many in one package, that in order to get one decent bill passed, you have to vote on all kinds of things. But I'm just saying, it is our job, we are sent here to vote, and it is important to the people of our district that they understand, they know what we are voting on.
Mr. Perlmutter.
And I agree with you guys, except that, and we had this conversation, we started it the other day on the open rules. And the complaint that we don't have enough open rules. Every time we do this, we have folks either delay and just cause all sorts of commotion or do lots of gotcha bills. And it doesn't matter whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. Both sides have done that and have closed the system and the process down because people are playing games. And I agree with you. This is about voting, but you can make a mockery of voting too, which is what's happened. And that's why we have to try to limit this. And I'm going to say, you know, Republicans did it because they felt the same way, that there was going to be either a gotcha, some little amendment that was going to make it impossible for people, or delay. And I can tell you, I've seen them both, on both sides. And until we grow up and respect the legislative process again, we're all in trouble. And we're trying to figure out a way to deal with open rules and to deal with something like this so that we can move in a business-like and legislative fashion that isn't just to game the system.
Gentlemen, you? Sure. Thank you very much. And while I agree with the en bloc, it's actually a proxy voting, so really not quite on point to what I proposed, but.
He got his off point.
No, I agree. I was just making that point, but back to the merits of the proxy voting, I think if more members had to sit there and go through it instead of vote by proxy, that too would help us get back to what I agree with my friend, a more reasonable, more adult way of proceeding. And maybe we just have to go through that. But I think, you know, you can kind of skip it all if you're proxy voting, because you're not down there, you're doing whatever you want to do. I just think we've reached the point we can get past that in terms of proxy voting. And I know this is a judgment call, Mr. Chairman. I don't question your judgment or anything else. Just raise the point. It's something we ought to consider and ought to do.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Morelli.
Yeah, I just want to, first of all, I appreciate Mr. Cole saying, I think this, two separate issues, the en bloc voting and proxy voting are two different things, and I would not want to conflate them. But I'm not going to support the amendment right now, but I do think this merits a fuller discussion because, frankly, I do agree with the gentleman from Oklahoma. There has been abuse on both sides, and the intent of proxy voting, as I understood it, and continue to understand it, is that in order to facilitate voting and action on the floor when people had limited ability to get here because either they had compromised immune systems or they had something related to the pandemic, it seems to me that I've seen members on both sides here early in the week and then voting by proxy later in the week. So I don't know if they suddenly developed the virus, and I would not question them. Perhaps they had other challenges related to the virus, but it was supposed to be pretty narrow. And while I won't support this now without a fuller discussion, I just wanted to express my sympathies for the sentiments expressed by the gentleman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Chair, may I respond?
Mr. Fishback.
Mr. Chair, I just want to, I know that this will be the last time, but, you know, we are being told that so much of what the Republicans are doing is dilatory, but it actually is in response. So much of what we're doing is in response to the fact that we are being shut out of any kind of input into the legislation that's coming through. And then just in closing, I would like to take issue with being told to grow up repeatedly. I don't think that's an appropriate thing to be saying in any committee in Congress, that I shouldn't be being told to grow up. So I do take issue with that. I want it on the record.
I'll apologize.
Let me just say, if this is a tactic, I think is not working, and it's certainly not moving us toward a situation where people feel confident that we can move forward in a way that, quite frankly, I think all of us who care about this institution want to move forward. But anyway, in any event,
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Who's who? Oh, Mr. Neguse.
I guess my question would be for our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, Because again, I think the ranking member is right to bifurcate these issues. The proxy voting amendment, the proxy voting that is the subject of his amendment, and I agree with Mr. Morelli that it merits further discussion and inquiry by this committee in the future, notwithstanding the amendment, and the en bloc voting. With respect to the latter, I guess I'm confused because I served, like Mr. Morelli and Ms. Scanlon, in the 116th Congress as our first Congress. It seemed to work fairly well. We now have this en bloc system, which my understanding is a direct byproduct of certain members in the House Republican Conference who are objecting to every single bill that is put on the suspension calendar, in effect eliminating any suspension calendar in the House, which compels us to pursue this en bloc process. And so I think you have allies with respect to eliminating en bloc voting. If someone can talk to a few of those members in the House Republican Conference and convince them to no longer do what they're doing, I presume, Mr. Chairman, we'd be able to move forward. Or am I mistaken in that, in my assumption?
No, I mean, I think there's a way forward here, but, and look at this whole issue, all the multiple parts of the issue we're talking about, probably does merit a fuller discussion, and maybe we should do that in this committee. Because we ought to figure out how we're going to move forward.
I know you mean that seriously. I take that as a serious suggestion. Perhaps we can do that and see if we can figure out a way.
Right. Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to echo Mr. Morelli's point about the Cole Amendment. I'm not prepared to support it at this point, but I do think it raises a serious issue. I think we should have some real analysis of what has taken place. I think that the proxy voting helped us in very significant ways through a critical period, but I would be curious to look at some of the numbers and whether there were abuses in different ways and when not. And I say that as someone who carried a lot of proxies as a local member, and I was happy to do it, but I noticed certain patterns that were, surprising me. And so, if we're going to move forward with it, I think we should really think it through. I yield back.
Everybody? Okay? All right. So now it's on the Cole Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
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 Opinion, chair, the noes have it. Roll call has been called.
Mrs. Torres.
No.
Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter.
No.
Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin. No. Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon. Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli. Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier.
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Ms. Ross. Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Neguse. Mr. Neguse, no. Mr. Cole.
Aye, but can I say something very quickly? I just want to thank my colleagues for the spirit in which the discussion took place, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate that, and I know we'll continue to have this, and maybe we can find some common ground on this. So thank you very much for your comments, multiple of you on this. I appreciate that.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Rushenthaler. Mrs. Fishbach. Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, report the total.
3 yeas, 9 nays.
It is not agreed to, and then we will figure out a time to have the fuller discussion. Next, Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Amendment, I move that a committee add language to the resolution that would eliminate the tolling of days for Section 7 of the War Powers Act. Mr. Chairman, this is once again the House abdicating its Article 1 authority by hamstringing the House's ability to bring up such legislation. While you and I certainly agree that the War Powers Resolution needs reform, closing off the opportunity for all members, including Democrats, on the fundamental issue of war, in my view, is inappropriate. Furthermore, as the House has proven it can handle a full legislative workload and voting times have normalized such legislation as this will not have a significant impact on the House's ability to operate on the floor. The American people are continuing to get back to work. It's important that we do the same. So urge adoption of that amendment.
You heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion?
Mr. Chairman, only that we've seen recent reports in the news media about some airstrikes that were conducted. I know you feel strongly about this. This is one of those things where we should not abdicate our authority.
And if the gentleman wants to introduce a resolution on the floor under the war powers, I will do everything I can to try to move it to the floor. I mean, if that's appropriate. I think the deal here is on the war powers stuff. I mean, we normally suspend it during recess times, and we're about to come into a period where there's 2 big recesses. I think this is short-lived, but in the short term, I will assure the gentleman that if this administration misuses its authority and gets and acts in a way that I believe that we should act, I will do everything I can to work with him to try to bring something to the floor. I appreciate that. The vote is now, anything else? Vote is on the Cole Amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. Being the chair, the noes have it. Who said that? I think it's Mr. Oh, okay, all right, okay. All right, a recorded vote has been requested.
Mrs. Torres?
No.
Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? No. Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon? No. Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Ms. Ross? No. Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Neguse? No. Mr. Neguse, no. Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, report the total.
3 yeas, 9 nays.
Matters not agreed to. Further amendments. Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment that would eliminate the ability to hold purely virtual hearings. I want to start by sincerely commending you and your leadership in bringing the Rules Committee together in this hybrid setting. I think that's a big step in the right direction. You're to be commended. It's extremely unfortunate, however, that many other committees, thank you very much, have yet to follow your leadership, despite an overwhelming majority of all committees members being present in Washington, D.C. They're still relegated to meeting over WebEx rather than together in hearing room. In fact, many are barred from even entering their own hearing rooms should they choose to do so. Such an important part of legislating is personal connections forged in face-to-face meetings. Many of those personal connections have been lost when solely meeting behind a camera screen. So this amendment would not block all remote access, would still allow for hybrid settings such as we employ here right now. Rather, we just make sure that members are meeting where they can face-to-face. And I sincerely hope that members of this body can see the benefits of personal rather than online connectivity. I know you probably have similar feelings, and this is just one of those dangers that I think you got to highlight from time to time, because this, for some people, they really enjoy this. I just think that's a big mistake for us long-term as an institution.
So I don't know all the details about which committees are doing what, but I think maybe that may be also the subject of our conversation that we have here.
That would be worth a conversation.
Yeah, so, but at this point, I'm going to say I would urge a no vote on this. But if it's happened, we should have this conversation and figure out how we're all going to move forward as a Congress, not just as an individual committee. So the vote now is on the Cole Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Being the chair, the noes have it.
On that, I'd ask to record a vote.
A roll call has been requested.
Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres?
I think she's...
Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? No. Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon? No. Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Ms. Ross? No. Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Neguse? No. Mr. Neguse, no. Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess?
Votes aye.
Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
How is Mrs. Torres recorded?
Mrs. Torres is not recorded.
Mrs. Torres?
Torres, no.
Torres,
no.
All right, okay.
Mrs. Torres?
No.
I think it's a no. Yeah, we're willing to concede that,
okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Clerk will report the total.
3 yeas, 9 nays.
Amendments not agreed to. Further amendments.
One last amendment from me, Mr. Chairman. I move that the committee add language to the resolution that would eliminate the tolling of days for the resolutions of inquiry. Mr. Chairman, I once again am offering a motion to restore the use of resolutions of inquiry. Again, this control over House operations no longer seems to be about the rapid response to COVID concerns. So we would hope that the Speaker and Democratic majority would loosen up in this particular area, beginning, an earnest to start back at the 117th Congress in a more normal footing. In one fell swoop, we've eliminated two critical minority tools, the motion to recommit and the use of resolutions of inquiry. And again, we would like to move on from that.
You heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion? Hearing none.
Chairman, I'll just mention that I've got a stunning resolution of inquiry pending on the origins of the coronavirus, and I would like to see Mr. Cole get his wish that we reestablish that.
Okay.
Go back.
Any other discussion? Vote is on the Cole amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. A roll call has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres.
No.
Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? No. Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Ms. Ross? Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Neguse? No. Mr. Neguse, no. Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mrs. Fischbach? Aye. Mrs. Fischbach, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
3 yeas, 9 nays.
Amendment's not agreed to. Further amendments.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule, and I
Dr. Burgess.
move the committee strike from the appropriate section the language relating to HJ Res 52, introduced by Representative Gosar of Arizona. Mr. Chairman, I'm disappointed that the Speaker is once again blocking Mr. Gosar from offering his resolution on the national emergency declared in March of 2020. It has been over a year since the President announced a national emergency regarding the coronavirus. In that time, we've continued to see tremendous progress as our country recovers. The vaccine is working, and President Biden's own scientists have backed up that claim. More state and local restrictions are being lifted each day here in Congress. As the attending physician has updated the guidance, we have seen the positive effects of our recovery from the coronavirus pandemic. Mr. Chairman, simply put, this seems like yet another way in which House Democrats are blocking debate on issues they find inconvenient. You have eliminated the traditional motion to recommit with instructions. You have turned off the tolling for the days of the War Powers Resolution. You have turned off the tolling for the days of resolution of inquiry. And now you are stopping the House from even debating whether the coronavirus remains a national emergency. You may still have concerns over the COVID virus, and those concerns are understandable. All that Republicans are asking is that we are afforded the ability to have such conversations on the House floor rather than yet again being shut out from all House processes. So I urge adoption of this amendment, and I yield back.
Yeah, thank you very much. I didn't realize that we needed a debate on whether or not COVID was a serious issue, not only in this country but around the world. And we have this Delta variant now that is unfortunately rearing its ugly head. We have cases in certain states, in certain areas where people haven't been vaccinated that are skyrocketing. We have international health organizations, in some cases, urging that people continue to wear masks because of what's going on here right now. So, anyway, I would urge a no vote on that.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I would just say that when we make those points on the floor in committee, and we don't prohibit the representative from offering his observations.
Whatever. All right. The vote is on the Burgess Amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. Opinion chair, the noes have it. Absolutely. I was going to ask for one. Can we have a roll call on that?
Mrs. Torres.
No.
Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter?
No.
Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? No. Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon? No. Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Ms. Ross? No. Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Neguse? No. Mr. Neguse, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mrs. Fischbach? Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
3 yeas, 9 nays.
That amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments.
Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule, and I move the committee make an order grant the necessary waivers for amendment number 58, offered by Mr. Graves of Louisiana to H.R. 3684. This amends the National Environmental Policy Act and revises the procedures and timing for the determination of the level of review. NEPA reviews often take years to complete, and these delays do not equate to greater environmental protections. This amendment would maintain the rigorous environmental protections, but streamline the process and clarify government agency responsibilities, eliminating outdated provisions and ensuring practical timelines for review. To have a clean infrastructure system, we must first build it. This amendment would ensure that it gets done sooner rather than later, and I urge this motion be adopted.
You heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Burgess amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Being the chair, the noes have it. A roll call has been requested?
No.
No, you got to wait till your name's called, yeah.
Mrs. Torres.
Okay.
No.
Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter. No. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin.
No.
Ms. Scanlon.
We got it.
Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli. Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier.
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Ms. Ross. Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Neguse. Mr. Neguse, no. Mr. Cole. Aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess. Aye. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Rushenthaler. Mrs. Fischbach. Aye. Mrs. Fischbach, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk will report the total.
3 yeas, 8 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have another amendment at the desk. I have an amendment for the rule in order to make my amendments numbers 125, 130, 140, 149 to H.R. 3684. You heard me delineate these amendments some time ago. I won't go through them all again, but I urge this motion be adopted so that the House may debate and vote on these important amendments.
Heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Burgess amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Being the chair, the noes have it.
No.
Noes have it. On a roll call? Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres.
No.
Mrs. Torres, no.
No.
Mr. Perlmutter. No. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin. Ms. Scanlon. No. Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli. Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier.
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Ms. Ross. Mr. Neguse. Mr. Neguse, no. Mr. Cole. Aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess. Aye. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Rushenthaler. Ms. Fischbach. Aye. Mrs. Fischbach, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
3 yeas, 7 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment.
Ms. Fischbach.
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment to the rule. I move that the committee make an order amendment number 92 offered by Mr. Jimenez of Florida to H.R. 3684. This amendment prohibits civil penalties created within the bill from being used to publicly finance campaigns. And Mr. Chairman, it's my understanding that during the markup of this legislation, this provision was accepted by the majority by unanimous consent, but unfortunately, it was stripped out of the Rules Committee print. This common sense amendment is good for taxpayers and transparency, and we find it unreasonable that the majority accepted a Republican amendment during committee only to strip it out. I urge support of this amendment, and I yield back.
You heard the gentlelady's amendment. Any discussion? If not, the vote is on the Fischbach amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Being the chair, the no has it.
No.
Mrs. Torres. Mrs.
Clerk,
Torres.
a recorded vote has been asked for. So,
Mr. Chair, I ask for a roll
all
call.
right, so a roll, I know, I just want to make, I'm trying to help the, okay. We'll start again.
Mrs. Torres.
No.
Okay.
Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter.
Torres, no.
No. Yes.
Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin. Ms. Scanlon. No. Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli. No. Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier.
No.
Mr. DeSanya, no. Ms. Ross? Mr. Neguse? Mr. Neguse, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mrs. Fishbach? Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, report the total.
3 yeas, 7 nays.
That amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment.
Ms. Fishbach.
Mr. Chair, I move that the committee make an order amendment number 244 offered by Mr. Balderson, Ohio, to H.R. 3684. This amendment ensures the seasons under the farm-related CDL program restart each calendar year on January 1 to prevent overlap of seasons from the previous year. Mr. Chairman, the farm-related CDL program has been critical in the agriculture industry for decades. Farm retailers, livestock and feeders, and other rural businesses use the program to service our farmers in 24 states. However, the program is due for updates. In my home state, this year's unseasonably warm spring led to an earlier planting season. The planting season the year prior was later than usual due to cold. These two factors led the businesses serving farmers in my district not being able to hire seasonal drivers due to the current 12-month limitation on issuance of new CDLs, leaving grain and other agricultural products stranded in the fields throughout my district. Restarting the 12-month clock on January 1 of every year will ensure that that this issue will never happen again. And I would like to add that the Senate adopted the same amendment in their markup, and I urge my colleagues to support this motion and the underlying amendment. I yield back.
You heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion? If not, the vote is on the Fishbach amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. Can you chair the noes have it?
No.
The noes have it. Would you like a roll call? And roll call has been asked for.
Mrs. Torres?
Torres, no.
Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter?
No.
Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Ms. Ross? Mr. Neguse? Mr. Neguse, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mrs. Fishbach? Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, report the total.
3 yeas, 7 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments? If not, the vote now is on the motion from Mr. DeSaulnier. Okay, well, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. We need to chair, the ayes have it.
On that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like
A recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres?
Torres, yes.
Okay, all right.
Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Raskin? Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, aye. Mr. DeSaulnier?
Aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier, aye. Ms. Ross? Mr. Neguse? Mr. Neguse, aye. Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Reschenthaler? Ms. Fishbach? No. Mrs. Fishbach, no. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk, report the total.
7 yeas, 3 nays.
Motion is agreed to. Mr. DeSaulnier is going to carry it for the Democrats.
Well, since Mr. Reschenthaler missed this invigorating hearing, we're going to make him carry.
Mr. Reschenthaler, opposed. And before we adjourn, without objection, I'd like to insert into the record statements from Mr. Sablan and Mr. Cicilline. And anything else?
Just quickly.
Yeah.
Again, I just want to thank you for the spirit in which we discussed some of these procedural issues that are knotty for us right now, and we look forward to having that longer discussion with you, and appreciate the fact that you gave them serious considerations, understand the reasons why you didn't support them at this time, but look forward to our continuing dialogue, and thank you for interjecting.
I appreciate it, and I appreciate everybody on both sides for the spirit of the conversation and for a long hearing. So with that, without objection, the committee is adjourned.